How much did Russian trolls really impact the 2016 election? And is this whole story really that big of a deal? Well, by now you've heard about Robert Mueller's indictment of 13 individuals and 3 organizations tied to Russian troll farms that allegedly helped Donald Trump's 2016 campaign. But were these troll farms really that effective? So before I get to that, I do want to point out that one of these organizations indicted in these charges was the Internet Research Agency. And this was an agency that was actually profiled in the New York Times back in 2015. And MSNBC's Chris Hayes had the author of that story on his program.
The journalist Adrian Chen profiled the Internet Research Agency in an investigative piece for the New York Times Magazine all the way back in 2015, calling it, quote, a shadowy organization in St. Petersburg, Russia, that spreads false information on the internet. In a podcast interview later that year, again, all the way back in 2015, Adrian Chen made this rather staggering and prescient observation.
I created this list of the Russian trolls when I was researching, and I'd check in it once in a while still, and a lot of them have turned into like conservative accounts, like fake conservatives. I don't know what's going on, but like, yeah, they're all like tweeting about Donald Trump and stuff. I feel like maybe it's some kind of really opaque strategy of like electing Donald Trump to undermine the U.S. or something, you know, like false flag kind of thing. That's how I started thinking about all of this stuff after being in Russia.
With me now is the reporter you just heard there, Adrian Chen, staff writer for New Yorker.
Okay, so here we have Adrian Chen, the author of this New York Times Magazine piece that was written back in 2015. And he essentially predicted the whole purpose of this Russian organization to help Donald Trump and to undermine the U.S. election. So what does he think about the effectiveness of this Russian trolling?
I mean, it seems like in some ways it's a remarkably effective model. With 90 people you're paying, you know, running an operation that doesn't cost that much money, it does seem like a sort of good bang for your buck.
Well, the effectiveness question, which everybody's talking about now, you know, it's of my personal belief that it isn't all of that effective. You know, it's essentially a social media marketing campaign with 90 people, a couple $1 million, a few $1 million behind it. Run by people who have, you know, a bare grasp of the English language and not a full understanding of who they're targeting, what they're targeting. I think if you think about that in terms of just a normal marketing campaign, that's not going to be a very good bang for your buck. I think that the paranoia aspect, right, the idea that there is this, you know, kind of all-powerful or, you know, immense propaganda machine that's going on, and that anybody who's tweeting something that you don't like or is, you know, kind of causing trouble on the internet can be chalked up to Russia, that is a very powerful thing that's going on and is really increasing now, I think, in the wake of these indictments in kind of a worrying way. There's not a lot of people saying, well, let's hold back, you know, maybe it's not all of that big of a deal.
Adrian Chen and Rosalind Hilderman, thanks for making the time tonight.
So after that big intro from Chris Hayes about how Hayes thinks that this Russian trolling is a remarkably effective model, Adrian Chen comes in, a guy who's been following this story since 2015, comes in and says, actually, I don't think it's all that effective. And says it essentially amounts to a social media marketing campaign. Which, yeah, that's what it is. And not only that, but it's from people who largely don't grasp the English language very well. So when you're trying to affect the US election in your second or third language, it's going to be a little tough to really make any real impact on the election. Now, that's not to say that these trolls aren't effective. I'm sure in some pockets, in some areas, people that are on Twitter all the time, people that base their voting off of their interactions on Twitter. I mean, we can get into so much about just this story that I just don't have the time to get into in this video. But these Russian trolls were creating fights on both sides. They had people who were both supporting Bernie and both against Bernie. People that were supporting Black Lives Matter, people that were against Black Lives Matter. The whole point was to create chaos. And in that chaos, push Donald Trump, in some respects, up as their choice for president. But just because Donald Trump won doesn't mean that it was the result of Russian trolling. That is what is so maddening about this whole media hysteria over Russia's meddling in the election. We're talking about internet trolls. That's what the discussion is about. They weren't hacking voting booths. They weren't, sending in Russian nationals to pretend to be American citizens and vote in the election for Donald Trump. No, we're talking about trolls on Facebook memes, Twitter fights. That's what this discussion is about. So yeah, it essentially amounts to a social media marketing campaign. And I find it funny how Chris Hayes quickly ended the segment. I don't know if this is just coincidence, but it really seems like whether it's MSNBC or Bill Maher's show, whenever somebody makes a great point in the face of the host, all of a sudden the segment ends. Oh, we got to go now. Got to go to commercial. I think that was a point that was worth exploring more. Something that isn't brought up very often on cable news. An actual author or a writer of a story that writes about Russia, that wrote about Russia meddling in 2015, about how he thinks that this really isn't that big of a deal and likely wasn't all that effective. Isn't that an idea worth exploring a little more, since that is something we don't hear about ever on cable news, where there should be discussions about these things and not just one-sided arguments? So all of this amounts to is McCarthyism, the paranoia. And that's something that Adrian Chen brings up in his response as well. The paranoia around this. It's like, now whenever there are, I see this quite often, when there are people who are progressives online, the common response to those progressives who believe in policies like Medicare for all, the response to them is, well, you're just a Russian troll. That's what this has come to. That's what this has turned into now, is fighting the left. Now, there's an aspect of this that, again, I can't get into in this video because it's not about that, but I have to just briefly mention. Bernie Sanders has now become a target because there were some trolls online, Russian trolls, that were pushing Bernie Sanders. What they failed to mention in that same argument is that there were also trolls, Russian trolls, pushing Joy Reid. In fact, Joy Reid was retweeted more times by Russian trolls than Bernie Sanders was. So is Joy Reid now the target of anger among this whole Russia hysteria? No, because she works for MSNBC. They're not going to bring that up, but they'll bring Bernie Sanders up and try to drag his name through the mud because ultimately they don't believe in progressive policy. That's what it's about. So any way they can try and undermine that and cut down the progressive movement, if they can do that by blaming Russia for it, then they'll do it. And that's exactly what they're doing. Now, you may wonder, why aren't more journalists like Adrian Chen out there talking about how this is really just a lot of paranoia? Well, here's a tweet from freelance national security reporter Christian Stork. And he said this: "Many reporters have told me in private they find this moment and its shrill hysteria both asinine and concerning. But the job market is so tenuous and anti-Russian/Trump ideology so ingrained and profitable that they fear pointing out the obvious. Dangerous trend for media." So reporters are fully aware that the news media is obsessed with this Russian narrative. But because the vast majority of cable news stations are on this, because the vast majority of publications are on this, nobody wants to come out and speak up against it, because it would mean they could be out of a job, because the job market sucks. So if the writers come out and are publicly against this narrative of how important Russian meddling in the election is, if anybody comes out against that, they potentially can't get their writing published. So we're lucky to have very few principled writers like Adrian Chen out there speaking up against this. And when he does, MSNBC cuts his segment short. Now, even if you think Russian trolls somehow affected the election, or you think the story is a big deal, you have to acknowledge that there are trolls within your own country. So, correct the record. A Hillary Clinton super PAC spent $8 million during the 2016 election to combat any negative press, tweets, or Facebook posts that was directed at Hillary Clinton. So, correct the record. A Hillary Clinton super PAC essentially did the exact same thing that Russian troll farms did in Russia. They paid people to fight back against negative press for their chosen candidate in a bid to try and affect the election. How is it any different? One is possibly backed by the Kremlin. The other is definitely backed by corporations and the wealthy. In both instances, neither one has the best interests of the American people at heart. They are both pushing their own narrative for their own chosen goals. And that isn't the goal of the average person in America. So, this is why I'm so bothered by this story. If you want to cover this Russian trolling, fine, good, cover it. I think it should be covered. But to make this the linchpin of your coverage every night, as MSNBC does, how can you call yourself the news media? What, like, you are being, I want to say disingenuous, but I think at this point they have convinced themselves that this is the most important story. So, I guess ignorant is the right way to frame it. If they were covering this honestly, they would also mention how there are other trolls trolling farms, like Correct the Record, who were openly doing this during the election. And the only difference being that they're backed by corporations and not the Kremlin. And even in that case, it's not yet confirmed if the Kremlin in fact did back those Russian organizations. But again, even if they did, what is the difference? So now you may wonder, okay, how can Russians be indicted on this, but Correct the Record, how can they do this legally? Well, this very thing was reported by MapLight in a story called Hacked Clinton Campaign Memo Lays Out Legal Basis for Coordinating with Super PAC. And in it, Correct the Record said that because it is posting communications online for free, its work should therefore be exempt from FEC rules regarding, quote, coordinated communications. That argument has stunned advocates for campaign finance reform, who argue Correct the Record is violating the spirit and possibly the letter of federal election laws. So, because Correct the Record has been able to find a legal loophole in being able to do what they were doing with their paid trolls, they were able to get away with it. But Russian nationals aren't able to get away with the same thing. So, again, this is all just bullshit. Like, this story, I'm covering it because this is what the news is talking about. But I'm covering it so you understand that this really isn't that big of a deal. I'm annoyed by Correct the Record trolls as much as the next person. But I would never claim that Correct the Record is exactly the reason that Bernie Sanders lost the primary. No. Just as it would be insane for me to claim that Russian trolls are the reason that Donald Trump won his election. Now, what's actually important, and the story that the news media doesn't cover for reasons that will become obvious, is the effect of the wealthy and corporations on elections. So this graph from the New York Times shows the influence of the wealthy on elections, where now the top 0.01% made up 40% of campaign contributions in 2016. And this graph doesn't even appear to include corporations. So we're just talking about the ultra wealthy, the 0.01%, making up 40% of all campaign contributions. And again, that doesn't include corporations or super PACs for that matter, where we don't know where the money is actually coming from. So if you're angry about Russian trolls, I get it. The idea of people making up fake accounts and trying to influence an election that in their mind benefits them is not a good feeling. You don't want that. You also don't want corporations and the wealthy affecting elections. Neither one benefits the average person. So for the focus to be completely on Russia trolls, Russia meddling in the US election, it's just misguided. It's disingenuous. I don't know if it's on purpose, but it's wrong. It doesn't give you the full picture. The actual issue in American politics is the influence of money on elections, and not just national elections. We're talking local and statewide elections as well. So they aren't talking about that. And why do you think MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, really any major publication or cable news network, why is nobody talking about the influence of corporations and the wealthy on elections? Because they are run by corporations and the wealthy. And in many cases, they are the wealthy. The hosts of these shows are wealthy. And they're run by a corporation. So that's why they don't focus on that story. But Russia meddling in elections, that's an easy one. These people, these news hosts and these companies, they're not Russian. They don't have any interests in tied in with this. They're able to point to them and look over there. They're the scary people. They're the scary ones. They're doing bad. While completely avoiding the fact that they themselves influence elections. Hey, if you like this video, hit that subscribe button below and consider throwing me a few bucks on Patreon at patreon.com/therationalnational or therationalnational.com/join.